Today, let's knit some socks for men. These will be knitted tubular with ribbing at the top. I'm using Mary Maxim Festive Feet Sock yarn, thus the name of the socks. It's a pretty classic sock yarn blend, a #1 yarn. It does take some preparation. You will definitely need to rewind it. And discussion of that and other tips about managing the yarn for a standard gauge machine are in a whole separate video, so I'll leave you to watch that at your leisure, and we will move on to the socks. I've been having a good time with this yarn, knitted some ladies' socks also, and with the odds and ends, enjoyed knitting some other projects such as booties and doll clothes, and you will be seeing all of those soon. If you prefer to work from written patterns, you might like these sock books. I have 6 of them available, and the one with socks most like we'll be knitting today is Sockination. I'll place a link to the sock page in the program notes. Usually, to knit tubular socks with ribbed tops, we start with the ribbing, then lift part of the ribbing, rotate it around to the other bed, and that's how we get into the tubular configuration, and then we knit the sock. The lifting and rehanging of those rib stitches is the part of sock knitting that everybody finds most difficult. So I figured out a way around it. We're going to start right here knitting the tubular part. Work down to the heel and short row it, knit the length of the foot and short row the toe, and then we will rehang and knit the ribbing. But we'll do it in 2 pieces and it'll be very easy. Before we get started, you need some basics. You do need to swatch. And if you cannot match both the stitch gauge of 8.5 per inch and the row gauge of 12.5 rows per inch, match stitch gauge because it's easy to adjust rows for the foot length. It's important to determine what stitch size the main bed versus the ribber need to be to get matching stockinette. On my pass-ups, 5.5 did it. That's stitch size 5 on both beds. Not all pass-ups match perfectly, and most Japanese setups with a main bed and a ribber don't. So this is groundwork that must be done in order to get a nice sock. Ideally, the fabric should be washed and dried before measuring gauge, but at least let it rest. These socks will fit a man who wears size 10.5 shoes in US sizing. Use 40 needles on each bed, racked so that they will not hit when all come forward. The needles must alternate. Knit a zigzag row with waste yarn at a low stitch size. Here, one of my needles didn't pick up a stitch, and if it's only one, you can just fix it manually. Now hang your cast on comb and weights. Pass-up knitters, you do not absolutely have to do this, but if you own a comb, I strongly suggest that you do use it. Japanese knitters, you do absolutely have to do this. You cannot successfully knit on the ribber without. You remove the wire from the comb, push the teeth up through the zigzag row, reinsert the wire, and hang a weight on the comb. Pass-ups, you will need to remove the strippers for the next 2 tubular rows, or at least one of them. Set the machine for tubular knitting. For pass-ups, that's CX. Brothers, 1 part button on each bed, and it must be the opposite part button. Singer Studio Silver Reed, it's done with your levers. The placement of those levers is slightly different on the different models. Superbas, it's those circular arrow keys. I also increased to main stitch size right away. And here my waste yarn gave me a little bit of trouble. I had pulled it out too much and didn't get rid of the slack. But because this is just the waste yarn, I'm going to push my naughty loops down in so they don't make any more trouble and not worry about it further. Pass-ups use black strippers. I know it's double bed work in theory, and so you were thinking orange strippers, but since one bed is knitting at a time, it's really single bed work and you need black. Work about 24 rows of tubular knitting here in your waste yarn. Now stop, snip that yarn, get it out of the way, and thread up our beautiful sock yarn. Set the row counter to 0. We're going to go right into knitting the tubular part of the sock top. Before beginning, rack so that the needles oppose perfectly and would hit if they all come out, but they won't. Work 100 rows on the counter to make socks the height of the sample. That's actually only 50 real rounds because the counter is counting off every pass of the carriage, but every pass of the carriage is half a round of knitting. Now we'll knit the heel on one bed. I'm going to use the front bed. If you're using a Japanese machine, you may prefer to do it on the back bed because that's your main bed. Japanese knitters may want to lower the river bed, put the sinker plate on, and knit the heel on the main bed, doing exactly what I'm doing as far as putting needles in and out of holding position, but doing it in the way that works for Japanese machines. Pass-ups keep both locks in operation at all times, so the setting for you is GX on the back bed, BX on the front bed, and a pusher up under every working needle on the front bed. Now what we're all going to do is begin by knitting the first row on all of the needles that are knitting the heel and progressively reduce the number of stitches knitting every row by one needle after knitting that row. This is done by lowering the pushers beneath the working needles on the pass-up, and it's done by pushing the needle all the way forward into hold position with the carriage set so it will hold in that position on Japanese machines. Superbas work like Japanese machines in this respect. In addition to placing the needles into hold, we will wrap the needle that was already in hold next to the last needle that knitted at the end of every row. That will keep the short rows tightly connected and prevent holey socks from forming. On Japanese machines, you may wrap the entire needle shank because it'll be coming forward and it will hold the wrap. On pass-ups, it's essential to wrap into the hooks because we cannot bring the needles all the way forward. So you see me wrapping into the hooks. You will also see that on pass-ups, sometimes it makes knitting the next row rather tight. There's a little bump as I start to knit, but it does knit over nicely if you have your stitch size and gauge correct. After the first few rows, you're going to need to hang some weight on the pocket of fabric that is forming to create the heel. I'm using the heavy forks that I explain how to make in my book, Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools. If you have pass-up heel grips, they work too. In theory, a selection of claw weights will work on Japanese machines, but honestly, I don't care for their performance very much at all. I much prefer either heel grips or the heavy fork. I was actually trying to emulate pass-up heel grips, which have become difficult to locate when I created heavy forks, and as it turns out, for me, they work even better. Continue to short row in until after placing the final needle in the hold, only 14 needles are in work. Before knitting the next row, on the side away from the carriage or locks, return a needle to work and continue doing that every row until all have knitted. On pass-ups, you simply lift the pusher under the needle to return it to work. On Japanese machines and Superbas, you push the needle back into upper working position. We don't want this. Where short rows join regular knitting, there's a tendency for a hole to form. Here's how we're going to get around that. After knitting the final row to the left, take the working yarn and wrap it around the needle on the opposing bed. Do the same after knitting the final row to the right. This is the row upon which every heel stitch has knitted again. That may be enough. If it is not enough on your particular machine with the yarn you're using, take the purl bump from, in this case, the back bed and hang it on the end needle on the front bed. If you were knitting the heel on the back bed, you would do it the other direction. But basically cross the beds with the purl bump from the row below, and that'll make a really tight joint. And you can see the heel fabric has developed. So we're done with the heel, and now we want to return to tubular knitting settings and set the row counter back to 0 so we can keep track of the foot rows only. For this size of socks and this gauge, 158 rows on the counter is going to produce the correct length of sock. We no longer need pushers in work, but we don't have to do anything about them because if we've changed to CX on a pass-up, they're not going to respond. They can be dealt with later. So knit your 158 rows on the counter and then repeat the heel instructions to make the toe. When the toe is complete, leave enough of a yarn tail that you're sure you can use it to close the toe eventually, change back to waste yarn, and scrap off. You're going to need at least an inch of knitting in waste yarn so as to be able to use it as a help when grafting. When that's done, break the waste yarn and drop the sock off of the machine. You can remove the comb now, and this is what you've got. Here's the toe area that will eventually graft together. And I have made a whole separate movie on grafting this exact sock for you to consult if you don't already know. By the way, grafting is also called Kitchener stitching. So at this point, we're ready to add the ribbing on. My waste yarn is closed at the top, which was really the bottom, so I'm going to go snip it open. And then we will lower the beds. Pass-up knitters are at a slight disadvantage here. We don't have a lot of working room, but you bring up the sock through the bed and hang every live stitch on one needle. Don't miss any. That's critical. Work so that you're looking at the wrong side of the fabric, the purl side, and on that side, the stitches of the main yarn will appear as little crosswise lines. This is why we make the waste yarn a completely contrasting color. It's so easy to see our main yarn stitches. We're only going to do half of them at one time, so hanging in is much, much easier than the knitting, the ribbing, lifting, and turning business. But actually, let's hang half plus one stitch. So this time we'll hang 41, the next time we'll hang 39. That is so that each end stitch may remain a knit stitch. It makes the work considerably easier. Stretching out the sock top and hanging part of one end on a needle just for temporary is like giving yourself an extra set of fingers when trying to keep the area open so you can easily see the stitches. And expect the last 3 stitches to be the toughest ones. When 41 are hung, put all the needles in line, close the beds, and hang a weight on the fabric to make sure it gets down out of the way. I recommend that everybody hang on the back bed, main bed for Japanese machines, because it won't make any difference to the outcome, and it's infinitely easier to do than hanging on the front bed. Then transfer every other stitch to the other bed, ribber if you're using Japanese terms, front bed for pass-ups, and we will proceed with knitting the ribbing in the normal fashion. Ribbing is normally knitted at 2 whole stitch sizes smaller than the main knitting, but I found that I only wanted it 1.5 stitch sizes smaller with the yarn I decided on for the ribbing. What I did is change to a same weight yarn that coordinated with the sock yarn so as not to have to try to match the sock top color repeat. Knit 24 rows of ordinary knit 1 purl 1 ribbing, then transfer back to the back bed and bind off. Now I wanted to bind off using a special bind off that I do. It's a manual version of the transfer bind off that works for me on pass-ups because of our limited workroom. I'm more comfortable working from left to right with this bind off. So I actually knitted 25 rows. It's not really enough to make any difference to the pattern. Whatever bind off you use, make sure to keep it relatively loose because this has to slide over the gentleman's foot, heel, and ankle before it gets up his leg. So you don't want to limit the stretch with the bind off. What I'm doing is pinching the stitch with my left hand, releasing it from the machine with my right hand, moving it over to the next needle with my left hand, bringing the needle forward with my right hand, wrapping the yarn into the needle hook with my left, and then repeating the whole thing. It comes out exactly the same as if I used a tool, but it gives you a little bit of extra control. Now hang the remainder of the sock top stitches, 39 of them, and repeat the operation so that we have ribbing completely around the top. All that's left is to seam the 2 segments of ribbing together, remove the waste yarn, and close the toe. The toe closing is a separate video. If you know how to Kitchener, you needn't bother watching it, but if you need a reminder, I've made a brand new video to help you. Instructions for getting a perfectly matched pair of socks are in the video about handling Mary Maxim Festive Feet yarn. So, happy knitting!